This video will probably come under the history section, but also commemorative because I think it's worth talking a little bit about, because it's one of the things I set out to do in this channel. Of course, cover topical issues in the news, but I also want it to be semi-educational. And I'm not saying I'm the originator of this stuff, but it's a question of helping to promote information that might not be that well known. That's why sometimes I cover news events that are not as documented as other news events. But I also think of that in history, and I may make more videos like this potentially. But with this one, it's something I was personally somewhat involved in the sense that I attended the commemoration service. And it's about the city of Benares tragedy. This was a British vessel, the SS City of Benares, and basically it was hit by a German U-boat in 1940. This is an order of service from a local church. And the 17th of September marked the 85th anniversary of this disaster. But the commemoration was held yesterday. And I'm pleased I went. It was very moving, a very moving thing. More so than I thought, to be honest. I thought, okay, there'll be a few hymns, there'll be a bit like a moment's silence or something. But they actually had the photographs of 11 Sunderland children. This was a local commemoration. 11 Sunderland children who were involved, and of those 11, 9 perished. And they had their photographs there, and some people in the congregation lit the candles, and I must say I found it very moving. So I'm just going to go into a little bit of a background about the SS City of Benares, and then get into the sinking. I'm not going to read out the whole article, but I will put a link to Wikipedia. And that's the thing, that's what I need to do, because I looked up SS City of Benares sinking 85th anniversary, and there's pretty much nothing. The last news source I could find, mainstream news source, was the BBC talking about the 80th anniversary. But this is one of those forgotten tragedies of World War II. I suppose it's not forgotten now. It certainly wasn't forgotten yesterday. It was fairly good turnout. There was about 60 people there. There was Boy Scouts. There was relatives of some of the children who perished. Just a little bit on the local connection. Why Sunderland? Well, this was part of an operation to evacuate children to Canada after the outbreak of the war. Now, of course, as we know, most evacuees from the cities went into the countryside, and after this disaster, Churchill ordered that it just stop, it cease. But basically, it was en route from Liverpool to Halifax in Nova Scotia, and it was hit by a German U-boat in the North Atlantic, closer to this side, about 600 nautical miles, I would say northwest of Ireland. And it was a terrible tragedy. 258 people killed, many of them children. And actually they had a bigger proportion of losses of children than either the Titanic or the Lusitania. I do try to think of maritime subjects without the go-to mention of the Titanic, but it is worth mentioning because as much as that was an awful tragedy, 54 children died on the Titanic of the 1,500 deaths. Far higher proportions in other maritime disasters such as the Lusitania. The Empress of Ireland disaster in 1914 had a very heavy number of women and children perish, and proportionally this was even worse. It was a luxury vessel, and it had been so in the 1930s. So we're not talking about a ramshackle sort of vessel here. We're talking about an ocean liner. Quite a big vessel. I'm just going to read out some background about the vessel itself, then about the disaster. I keep saying disaster because whilst it was hit by a German U-boat, I genuinely think, based on the circumstances, they didn't know that it was a civilian vessel. And one thing that I find inexplicable, and I asked a few people yesterday and they didn't really know the answer, is why it was painted in basically military livery. The only explanation one can imagine is that because it was acquiesced by the government, as opposed to being in civilian service, that's the reason they done it. But in retrospect, it looks like an incredibly reckless thing to do. You know, the Atlanta campaign was the longest campaign of the war, and U-boats were active. So it seems incredibly reckless not to have had that in its civilian livery. Anyway, without further ado, I'm just going to read a bit of a background about the ship itself and then about the night of the sinking. And it was night time, so you can imagine how terrifying that would be. Okay, the SS City of Benares was a British steam turbine ocean liner built for Ellerman Lines, that's based in London, by Barclay Curl and Co. of Glasgow in 1936. It reminds me actually a little bit of the Normandy, the famous French liner, the Normandy, perhaps a little bit smaller, but an ocean liner. One quick thing, just because it's not mentioned here, City of Benares, that actually comes from the old name of Varanasi, the holy city on the Ganges, so that's where that comes from. And that was its route actually to the Indian subcontinent. During the Second World War, City of Benares was used as an evacuee ship to transport 90 children from the United Kingdom to Canada. The German submarine U-48 sank her by torpedoes in September 1940 with the loss of 260 people out of a complement of 408, other sources say 258, including the death of 77 of the evacuated children. That's higher than either the Lusitania or the Titanic. The sinking caused such public outrage in the United Kingdom that it led to Winston Churchill cancelling the Children's Overseas Reception Board (CORB) plan to relocate British children abroad. I'm not even sure why those specific children were chosen. I mean, Sunderland was a port city, but so were other cities. I'm not sure why, for example, those children were singled out. Although perhaps this was going to be an ongoing programme. A little bit more on the pre-war history. City of Benares was built by Barclay Curl in Glasgow, Scotland. She was launched on the 5th of August 1936 and completed in October 1936. Benares, as she was known, was 509 feet long, 155 metres, with a beam of 62 feet 7 inches and a draft of 30 feet 8 inches. She was powered by 3 steam turbines, which were supplied by Camel Laird. I think that's based in Newcastle, actually, if I've got that right. I know that shipyard. I think it's a shipbuilding company. They were oil-fired and drove a single screw via single reduction gearing, giving her a speed of 15 knots, though during her trial she achieved a speed of 17.75 knots without excessively pressing the turbines. Her maiden voyage departed on the 24th of October 1936 from Liverpool to Bombay via Marseille, Suez and Karachi. Her return voyage departed on the 7th of December 1936 with a full cargo of Indian produce. From the beginning of her maiden voyage to the sailing of City of Port Elizabeth in 1952, she was the largest and most modern ship in the Ellerman fleet. She was also the only ship in Ellerman lines that had more than one funnel, though her forward funnel was a dummy. She was managed by City Line Limited on behalf of her owners, Ellerman Lines Limited. The UK official number was 164096 and her call sign was GZBW. And I'm just looking at she's an impressive looking liner, 2 funnels, an elegant sort of streamlined shape. Just looking at the tonnage here, let's see, it's quite a big vessel, 11,081 gross tons, displacement 17,000 tons, so quite a sizable vessel. Okay, I'm going to go into the night of the sinking. There's other vessels, incidentally, with this name. List of ships named the City of Benares. There's at least, I'm counting at least 6 there. Okay. So the night of the sinking, and one can imagine the terror of that. I'm not going to read out the whole article. I'm going to read out the first paragraph or 2. The SS City of Benares, a British steam passenger ship, sank on the 17th of September 1940. This was, remember, in the height of the Blitz. The ship was en route to Montreal, Canada, then to Quebec City and later to New York City. She was carrying 406 people, 209 crew, 6 convoy representatives and 191 passengers, of whom 100 were children ages 2 to 15. Most of the passengers were British, Australian or Canadian, though 23 were from other countries, while most of the crew were Indian, of whom 23 were under the age of 16. So we're also talking about young Indian lanciers, I think is the term that's used. The ship was discovered by a German submarine, and in the middle of the night she was torpedoed and sunk, killing nearly all on board. And because of the haste of this disaster, all happened in 31 minutes. Many of the lifeboats couldn't be launched properly, which is actually similar to the Victoria disaster during the Great Storm of 1953. Just going forward a bit to the aftermath of this, the U-boat involved was U-48. Had no idea there were women and children aboard the Benares. The ship had been painted grey instead of her normal peacetime bright colours. This caused the crew of U-48 to believe she was a cargo ship carrying goods for the USA trade. I'm just going forward a little bit. Back on U-48, Heinrich Blakerod, this is the commander of U-48, decided not to give up on the massive targets, so they obviously had this in sight. At 10:01 p.m, Blakerod, that's Bleichrodt, ordered another torpedo sent towards the ship. It sped towards the liner unsuspected, and 119 seconds after being fired, slammed into the Benares' side. The torpedo made contact on the port stern, exploding just beneath the children's quarters. One can only hope that it was quick, if anyone died there, that it was quick. By approximately 10:03 p.m, it had obliterated the children's bathrooms in the number 5. Captain Nicol, this was on the city of Benares, was in his cabin with McKinnon. Like I say, I've forwarded here. That'll be one of the crew members discussing when the convoy should disperse and how it should be carried out. I should have mentioned they had a Royal Naval convoy up to a certain point, but they were actually on the cusp of leaving. In fact, I think at this point they had, because it was deemed that it was safer at this point. Although his cabin was just one deck below the bridge, at the forward part of the ship of the boat deck where 10 of 12 lifeboats were, and a torpedo was struck in the stern, he felt the faint tremor of the blast. He quickly made his way to the bridge. His first decision was to turn on the alarm gongs, which rang throughout the ship. However, due to electrical damage, the alarms rang for only a few minutes in the fare-paying passengers' quarters. So you can imagine the chaos. So just read a little bit about the evacuation. Bess Walder, aged 15, was one of 44 girls that were asleep on the port side of the ship. She was immediately awakened by the explosion. Climbing down from her bunk, she shook the girl sleeping in her lower bunk, Ailsa Murphy, aged 10. The other girl, Patricia Allen, who'd survived a recent U-boat attack on the Volendam, my goodness, was already awake. The girl felt a sense of deja vu and is quoted to have said, "Fancy, it happened again." I'm not sure if she survived or not. There's a lot of extra information here, a lot of testimony from some of the survivors and some others. One of the heroes that came out of this was a woman by the name of Mary Cornish, who had been part of the... I'm not sure if she was in the rescue party, if she'd been on the ship. I'm not quite sure about that. But I'll just read this out, the last few paragraphs. Let's see. Bess Walder and Beth Cummings found their lifeboat station, lifeboat number 5. Their escort, Maud Hillman, was here with 10 other children besides Bess Walder, Beth Cummings, Betty Unwin, Joan Irving, or Ailsa Murphy. James and Joan Spencer, aged 5 and 9, also stood by. While waiting for rescue, Ailsa Murphy succumbed to her wounds, which mercifully came while she was unconscious. The escort holding Ailsa lowered the dead girl into the sea and said a prayer for her. The chief escort, Marjorie Day, aged 53, not unlike Mary Cornish, had been only steps away from her cabin when the ship shuddered. She quickly entered her cabin, which was already filled with water, grabbing her coat and vital identification papers and other papers for the CORB programme. She managed to find a list of all 90 CORB children and which groups they were in. Then the escort crawled out of her wrecked cabin, finding water coursing through the hallways and corridors. She heard screams from nearby cabins. "Get up you go now," she shouted, banging on doors and pulling children from rubble. Most of the children were wearing not a kapoke vest, I'm not sure what that is, but as a survivor later put it, the perfectly horrible life belts. I know that old life belts could actually be dangerous because the cork that was used if you jumped off a sinking ship, it could actually spray in your neck because of the jolt that it caused, so they redesigned life belts later on. She was relieved that the children had paid attention to the drills. She found a doctor, Margaret Seal, aged 30, who began helping Day to pull children, mostly girls, from the damaged cabins. As they were doing this, one of the 4 nurses, stewardesses employed by Purser John Anderson, came by and told them that a boy on the starboard side had been killed in the explosion. Miss Day, Dr. Seal and the nurse, plus about 15 girls and boys made their way to the promenade deck. Now I'm going to read out just a little bit of some of the local thing. In Sunderland, we apparently had more children than any other city represented. For example, although it sailed from Liverpool, Liverpool had 10 children, Sunderland had 11, because Sunderland was deemed to be a major target, although certainly Liverpool was very heavily hit in the Blitz. So, they had, this was a moving service. They had a male voice choir, but they had Near My God to Lee, which is always evocative, and also For Those in Peril on the Sea. I honestly was quite moved by it. And I'm just going to read out the names of the 11 Sunderland children involved. Geoffrey Crawford, Maureen Dixon, Derek Lee, Billy Short, Peter Short, Edith Smith, Irene Smith, Thomas Watson, Anne Watson, Dorothy Wood, and Eleanor Wright. And of those, only Eleanor Wright and Billy Short survived. There's a sad thing with Billy Short. His younger brother, Peter, had been apparently sick that day and was in the sick bay, and the two brothers got separated, and the older brother tried his best to find his younger brother, and sadly he couldn't. Some of them spent 8 days on a lifeboat in up to the knees in water. You can imagine how cold that would be. One of the heroines of this, I mentioned the woman Mary Cornish. I believe she got a George Cross for her efforts. She, despite the conditions they were in, she kept the children comfortable. She sang songs. She massaged them to try and keep them warm. So I believe she got a George Cross. Geoffrey Crawford also got a posthumous honour. I believe he was only 13 or 14. He was I think a Boy Scout, and he done a lot to help other children, but he died in the disaster. And yesterday I saw a little statuette that was actually made by his comrades, and it was quite something. I also saw a little original book pre-war about the city of Benares, and it really was quite a luxury vessel. The first class suite really was quite that sort of 1930s Art Deco style. We're not talking about a ramshackle ship here. There were some maritime disasters in the Second World War, and the vessels were really quite inefficient, but the SS City of Benares was a luxury liner. Those old maritime posters, the really elegant ones. It was like something you'd see on those. Of course, this isn't anywhere near close Britain's worst World War II maritime incident, and probably the worst in our history, the RMS Lancastria. The Lancastria, again, had largely been overlooked for years. Only when the 80th anniversary came about in 2020 was it sort of remembered. It was hit by the Luftwaffe. I think it was part of Operation Arenal, if I've got that right. But that was a massive disaster. It thought, we'll never know the true toll, but because it was crammed with refugees, it could be somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 people perished, which makes it not only Britain's worst maritime disaster, but one of the world's worst. The single worst in history and the worst of World War II was the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was actually a German liner, and it sank, I believe, in the Baltic. 1945, it was hit by a Soviet submarine. Massive disaster. Somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 may have perished because it was so crammed with refugees. And I did see a television film about that recently, and might check it out again. But in wartime, maritime incidents just don't get as remembered as peacetime. The Lusitania is well remembered for the fact that it was a civilian liner, and it arguably brought America into the war. Although I'm not sure how true that is, because the Lusitania was 1915. The United States didn't formally join World War I until 1917. It did cause significant anger in America and significant anti-German sentiment. There is one more thing I should read out. Yesterday at the service, they mentioned that the captain of the U-boat, the commander, felt deep remorse and never commandeered again. That may not be entirely true, because in the aftermath there was, let me get this, there was actually an inquiry into whether war crimes had been committed. There was a piece on this, if I can find it. In the end, they were exonerated. So, as I understand it, Commander Burkhardt didn't express any remorse. However, some of his crew did. But they always maintained that they had no way of preventing this. There was a section on Wikipedia, I'm just looking for it now, about maybe it's actually on let's see, it's worth reading this out a little bit. On the SS Benares, let's see, sinking, aftermath. There is a grainy photo here of the HMS Anthony rescuing survivors. You can imagine the terror of this in the middle of the night, having a torpedo. There's a headstone here in Ullapool, I think that's in Ross and Cromarty in the Scottish Highlands, to Nurse Agnes Wallace, who was lost in the sinking of the SS City of Benares in 1940. She died in the arms of Colin Ryder Richardson in Lifeboat 2. Let's see, here we go. After the war, U-48 Commander Blackrock was put on trial by the Royal Navy for war crimes. He denied any prior knowledge of the presence of children. That's probably true, stating his actions were within the bounds of military policy because City of Benares was in a convoy at night with lights off. Why? Doesn't really... That is strange, I must say. The only eyewitness for the prosecution was a BBC radio broadcast by Frank Laskier, a merchant mariner turned wartime propagandist who claimed to have found the frozen bodies of dead children, and with sailors' intuition knew the Germans were waiting to sink the ship. Coming down now, Christian, I'm just finishing a video. The prosecutors also claim without evidence there were secret orders by the German government. The Navy wanted a scapegoat and they were hoping to secure a conviction by trapping him with his own affidavit statement. Blackrock was warned about this, so he remained silent during his incarceration as to not accidentally perjure himself. Lacking evidence, the Navy was forced to let him go. Several of the crew of U-48, including the radio operator, later expressed shock and regret once it became known the ship had been carrying children. Blackrock himself never mentally recovered. Okay, so that is on record. The next time he went to sea, he had a mental breakdown and was reassigned to training duties. Several historians have supported the German position, including Kate Tildesley and Tildesley, curator at the Naval Historical Branch, Ministry of Defence, who wrote, "What was not known by Blackrock was that the liner he was attacking carried 90 children." And whilst Germany certainly committed many war crimes in the Second World War, it is very strange that they would take those decisions, to paint the livery the way they did and to turn the lights off. It was incredibly reckless, but suffice to say, after the disaster, that they ceased that programme. As you probably heard, my friend's at the door, so I better go down and not keep him waiting. But that was a very moving thing, and amongst those present were the Sunderland Life Brigade. So that's the thing. Okay, I will, we'll leave it there.